Francisco Gonzalez, who has a new book called Creative Destruction, Economic Crises and Democracy in Latin America, which is a really interesting political economic analysis of economic crises in Latin America, starting with the Depression, all the way up to the period that we'll be talking about.
I think I'm going to put some faces into what Barbara has said. She explained very nicely and with a lot of substance the causes of some of the crises in Latin America and what Europe might learn from them. I have some paradigmatic examples, if you want to call them. The first one is Chile, which is part of that early example. Barbara reminded us what inflated that credit bubble was the petrodollars, a more than tripling of the debt. This is an authoritarian regime which interestingly had been in power since 1973 and since 1975 had become the revolutionary, trying to bring into reality what had until then been seen as blackboard solutions in the University of Chicago, the original free market revolution. This did not stop Chile from being a big debtor with a tripling of its debt between 75 and 82. Most of this debt was incurred by the private sector. So here I suppose it would look a bit more like Spain, like Ireland, than like Greece or Italy. In particular, grupos económicos, economic groups or conglomerados led by banks who ended up acquiring all sorts of businesses, from heavy industry, chemicals, to provision of services to hotels, ended up creating grupos económicos. The structure of the economy became very concentrated. And Barbara mentioned, the factors that created the perfect storm. A ratcheting up of interest rates to kill stagflation in the US. Chile, which relies 2/3 on copper, at least back then, to make ends meet, to earn hard currency, fell as interest rates went up and economic activity in the US and in Europe started to disinflate. And then Barbara reminded us about the trigger, who pulled the trigger. Mexico's Minister of Finance in August 82 declaring the country could not meet its obligations, calling a 3-month moratorium, and that dried up credit for everyone. Who was involved? Here's where some of the faces regarding the transnational policy networks come in. Well, certainly President Ronald Reagan's government was involved. The head of state in Chile, General Augusto Pinochet. By 1980-81, both Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan had made official pronouncements about Chile being the country of the future and saying that the US, the UK should follow the example of Chile, this radical retrenchment of the state, allowing market forces to lead pricing signals to accommodate everyday transactions rather than state interventions. The transnational policy network in action for the Chilean case was clearly led by US influence. Some of the numbers there are pretty staggering and annoying to non-Chileans, at least. The country received 30% of net World Bank and IDB transfers for Latin America, even though its economy only represented about 3% of the region. So having the US as your broker at the IMF, at the IDB, at the World Bank, crucial to get some short-term liquidity to at least put a floor on the level of economic decline. And here you've got the man in the middle, Carlos Cáceres Contreras, Minister Cáceres, very close to Pinochet, a technocrat, someone with an MBA at Cornell, a doctorate at Harvard, experience at Wall Street, a TA at the University of Cornell for economics, Around him was forged, this kind of cohesive epistemic community. So many of these new free market economists from the University of Virginia, Chicago, Friedrich Hayek flew to Chile to prop up support for this new model, this new way of doing things. So the transnational policy network was coordinated by one individual with a multiplicity of memberships in very select clubs. Scholar, well known in scholarly circles, even though he had not been a scholar himself. Within the policymaker environment, this is someone who was president of the central bank. You'll see that many of these people who become central to the management of the crisis and becoming the most effective interlocutors vis-a-vis the U.S., the international financial institutions, at some point were presidents of the central bank of their country and/or ministers of finance. Cáceres was also minister of finance. He had experience in the markets. He worked in New York, and the end result was this very cohesive train of thought and train of series of actions in favor of going the orthodox debt management route. Chile suffered the worst collapse in the southern cone countries just in terms of fall in GDP. 5 negotiation rounds with the creditor banks, all of them framed, as I said, by the strong support from the US and its leading voice in the IFIs. There was an early standoff. The neoliberals in Chile were, you cannot blame them for it, they believed really at heart what they were preaching. They thought that credit could not be misallocated, or that credit in private hands would not be used inadequately, because at the end of the day, people wanted to preserve their self-interest. It's a bit like the Greenspan quote of, "I'm in a state of shocked disbelief, not understanding why these people could have acted against their own self-interest." Well, the Chilean state had not given state guarantees on a majority of these private loans. So the potential for all these banks, all these grupos económicos to walk away from it gave Chile some leverage when it had to negotiate with the US. The creditor bankers, which Barbara identified, got together. They bullied the Chilean government to assume state liabilities, but not until the bankers in fact had accepted a 30 to 35% haircut on those original loans. The fiscal cost of the bailout, 42% of GDP. End result, Chilean taxpayers and IFIs incurred significant losses. Moving to the next decade, so this is the 1980s, everyone went underwater except for Colombia. It took Venezuela a bit longer to go underwater, but the largest economies did. The very strong support once the debt negotiations had been agreed by the US, the IFIs, and Chile meant that, with that strong financial support, Chile's bounce was more sustainable than any of the neighbors, compared to Uruguay or to Argentina. The famous Tequila Crisis that Barbara mentioned, what inflated this bubble was something that she also mentioned, which was the restructuring of the debt via the Brady Plan, which provided debt relief. There was, after all parties assuming losses for a period of 5-6 years, they all decided to come to the table, give in a bit, and so the bankers provided some debt relief. There were some haircuts. The governments promised to create or move towards free market reforms, and very importantly, secondary market for sovereign debt was created. Mexico became one of the poster boys of this early new belief, new faith in financial flows, in free flows. The governments, the incoming governments of Mexico and the US 1989 floated the idea of forging a free trade agreement. So there was quite a new narrative about this hopeless place which had been underwater for 5-6 years, but the U.S. now helping it out. Big revival of foreign financial flows. 40% of total flows, 89 to 95, went within Latin America, went to Mexico. The bubbles in Brazil, in Argentina, came a bit later. Now, a perfect storm. 1994, a tough year in Mexico. You're talking about a country that was not ruled by the military, was ruled authoritarianly, but by a civilian regime which had been in power then for 6 decades. Incredible political shocks, the rise of a guerrilla movement, an indigenous guerrilla movement, the day NAFTA came into effect, January the 1st, 1994. Massive PR success for the guerrillas. Assassination of the PRI presidential candidate, something that had not happened in Mexico since 1928. There had not been much political violence in Mexico. To try to compensate for this and aware about the potential consequences of a dramatic pullout, the government started issuing dollar-indexed bonds to keep the pension funds, to keep the banks buying Mexican bonds. And within 5 months, this had swollen up to $30 billion at the time of the election. It was left to the incoming government, so the previous government stepped down, Salinas, who engineered this neoliberal turn in Mexico, and the successor under Cedillo, and here again we look at some of the faces, was left to deal with this time bomb. Being a poster boy, it was difficult for the U.S. to just turn its back on Mexico. We were now partners. The TPN, the Transnational Policy Network, again, was put in action through U.S. leadership. U.S. Congress refused to help Mexico. The U.S. Congress had changed hands. The Republicans were on the front, on the cockpit now, in 1994. And it was up to President Clinton and Secretary Rubin to use this Exchange Stabilization Fund to start putting together a pot of money, an initial $20 billion, which then, thanks to U.S. influence, another 30 were put together. Again, the key people, Guillermo Ortiz, Ernesto Cedillo, all of them with strong technocratic credentials, PhDs in economics, Yale, Stanford. Ortiz with important banking experience. He was the key broker who privatized Mexican banks in the early 1990s. Moreover, by then, the Mexican side decided to bring on board some of the newly minted Mexican tycoons, billionaires, to come to Washington and help to ask for help. Help was not the result of altruism. We know now, or the partnership with NAFTA, it was a self-interested decision. Secretary of the Treasury Rubin was very aware that major Wall Street players were heavily involved in Mexico, Soros, Salomon Brothers, Nomura, and so this was a way of ensuring that creditors got back their money. That's the typical V bounce back that Barbara was talking about earlier, which ended up happening. The fiscal cost of the bailout, around 20% of GDP. My cousins, my acquaintances, my parents, they keep paying for it. If I ever went to go back to live in Mexico, my children would continue to pay for it. There's a lot of those liabilities still under this IPAB, un instituto to promote ahorro. I was going to do Brazil and Argentina, and I knew 15 minutes, no way. One thing I wanted to mention is that when the financial crisis in East Asia hit, the IFIs were forced to tweak a bit that unqualified support for orthodox stabilization, although with still the conditionality and austerity bias that Barbara mentioned. And I'm happy to discuss, question and time, Brazil and Argentina end up suffering brutal crises, particularly Argentina. They, in fact, were propped up by the IMF 2 or 3 years before the collapse, but both of them ended up collapsing. Conclusion, for transnational policy networks to work in periods of financial distress, key, get support of dominant player in IFIs. For us, it was the US. For the Europeans, it's the big European voting bloc, in those cases. There, I think you have a good ally. To put floor on a crisis, you need a credible provider of unlimited liquidity. For us, it was potentially the Federal Reserve. For you, it's been the ECB and Draghi's commitment to do whatever it takes to save the euro. Now, that support is a function of a variety of things. Crucial for the cohesion of the transnational policy networks is that individual and his group, her group, with all these multi-membership credentials, private banking, IFIs, academia, knowledge as power, no, as Michel Foucault would say. Debtors leverage a function of the stakes for creditors, but also of the costs of the failure for supporters of the free market paradigm. IMF, World Bank, hammering at this a lot of the time. They did not want to lose face, and so it was also in their interest not to allow some of these crises to end up, say, like the one in the 1980s. High fiscal cost of the bailouts passed on to societies, and here notorious absence of representation of main affected social sectors in these transnational policy networks. Thank you.